stand by the socialist mission. From Karl Marx and Manstein and Harvey and King, Billy Bachman reporting the red straight, and the young folk who died out in Spain.
In their election manifesto, Paul Kenny, who is the General Secretary of the DNB, said, "This is not the European Union we signed up for. There have been fundamental changes. People should hear the arguments about Europe and put it on the table. Maybe we should have had a vote before the signing of the Lisbon Treaty." So that was Paul Kenny, the General Secretary of that union. That poses, I think, a question for all of us on the left and for the trade union movement. Because if there is a referendum, as things stand at the moment, the major people who will be putting the arguments against the European Union or about the European Union will be from the right wing in the UK and people on the right wing of the Tory party. And they'll be attacking specific things, and they'll be confusing the European Court of Human Rights, which of course has got nothing to do with the European Union, formed before it, including the socialist countries among its members in the past. So that has nothing to do with it. They'll be confusing that with the European Union, and the left's arguments on the issue of the European Union will not be heard, will be submerged. And if there is a no vote, or if there is pressure for renegotiations, it will be on the terms set by the right. That's the challenge we have before us. Because there is an overwhelming argument from the point of view of the left about the EU as a neoliberal instrument of business. We need to understand that and understand what needs to be changed, or whether the whole thing needs to be removed and some other organization internationally put into place. So that, I think, is the reason why we've got this meeting here, this workshop, and why there are so many people at it. Because people are beginning to realise it's very important that the left discusses the issue of the European Union critically. So we've got here Eddie, who I said is chair of the Scottish Campaign Against Eurofederalism and is an expert on this subject. So Eddie, if you could lead off the discussion and then we'll take it from there.
Thanks, John. I'd like to carry on from John's remarks, from those opening remarks, to say that the European Union being that arm of the neoliberal wing of capitalism, it represents, and especially in this period of capitalist collapse and economic crisis, it represents an acute danger to working people in this country. And that's why it's a responsibility of us, we are the activists, we are here today, we're discussing this subject, actually to take the lead in opposing the European Union, because it is a cartel, it is a coming together of failed capitalism for their own benefit, to help them survive in this, what has been described as an ongoing crisis of capitalism that is the worst crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s. You know, Marx clearly describes the cyclical nature of boom and bust of capitalist crisis, and this one is one of the biggest ones. Some people point to the absolute decline of capitalism, and we're on that road. It's not just Europe, it's world capitalism, and the danger is war to solve their problems, as they did in the First World War and the Second World War. So militarism and NATO and EU, it's all intertwined, there's no big dividing line here. And these are all of vital interest to us as activists of the working class. We've got to take the subject in our grasp. It's a complicated subject. When you look at the transatlantic trade investment partnerships and all the treaties that flow from that, it's actually difficult. subjects to tackle. We've got to make a determined effort to look into these treaties. I myself have actually neglected, during this referendum campaign, actually neglected looking into the nitty-gritty of these campaigns. And I think I'm typical of a lot of us. We haven't actually grasped the big nature of the threat to working people, to the whole population of this country, of capitalist collapse, of continuing crisis, of cuts to come, cuts that have been held back because elections have to be won by political parties. Parliamentarians are afraid of making these cuts because they know that our anger will be something that we will have to pay for. And it's the anger that we've seen in both sides of this referendum campaign. The anger of people who are impoverished. And I like the word impoverishment rather than austerity. Austerity has got a kind of meaning of being austere, and you go along with the kind of puritanism of living frugally and all that kind of thing. That's the meaning of austerity. I prefer the word impoverishment because that is what has been happening in Greece, in Portugal, and in Ireland. Our brothers and sisters in Ireland, who we are so interconnected with, are faced with emigration again. And we've heard of the songs that sing of the wild geese going off to fight in foreign wars for foreign governments. The youth of Ireland were wasted in that way. So it's happening again. Great emigration from Ireland. That's a warning for us of what can happen here. So I prefer the word impoverishment. Capitalism collapsing in the world. There's more cuts to come. It hasn't been solved. The European Union, the capitalists of the European Union are getting together in this cartel, and they have been doing it for decades, to defend themselves. And the only source of their wealth is, as you know, as we well know, is the labour power of workers. So they want to doubly exploit workers to push up the profits and save themselves. We've heard Neil Findlay this morning speaking of the importance of solidarity, trade union unity, and he makes a frank assessment of those divisions in the referendum campaign. But what I've just said is enough, quite enough, to bring us together in defence of our very existence in the face of world capitalist collapse, of the European Union doubling its efforts to exploit us. And Neil made a great appeal for workers to stand together again, a united struggle against capitalism and its political representatives. And some of those political representatives are also advocating exit from the EU. We don't want them to be taking the lead because it means that capitalism is in the driving seat of this. We want workers, the socialists, the revolutionaries, the Marxists, I don't need to go through the whole list, but you know who we are. We're here, we're the activists. We've got to take the lead in this campaign against the depredations, the exploitation of the European Union. Gordon Munro's pointed out solidarity with workers elsewhere, and Lillian exhorted us to discuss. Chris said, don't opt out trade unions, and that's a big thing. We've got to rebuild the power of the trade union movement, and where better to make the albeit complicated case in this campaign to point out the real dangers from the European Union. We've got to rebuild industry, and that means getting out of the clutches of the European Union to invest in our own indigenous industries. And we've got to rebuild the very trade union movement that can actually advocate that. Tommy Morrison pointed out the low turnout in that unison vote. We've got to solve that problem. We cannot have potential strikes going out on such a low turnout. We've got to re-enthuse, try and turn the enthusiasm of that referendum campaign back into the trade union movement so we can get real grassroots power back into it. And I also observed during the campaign that on the yes side, I was a campaigner for unity of the trade union movement, but I also observed on the yes side a great understanding of what sovereignty meant. I would like to appeal to the yes voters and the yes campaigners to use that understanding of sovereignty to actually look at what the European Union is doing to sovereignty, how it destroys sovereignty, popular sovereignty, the sovereignty of the people to govern itself. I think those on the yes side also had an understanding of that, a deep understanding that they could bring to this campaign against the destruction of, I think nation states were actually created by the working class. A million threads united us in struggle and combination through the 18th and 19th century to bring together a social force that could resist the new capitalism. And that was really what brought that sense of solidarity and created a nation. Now, it's up to you to decide what nation we might be talking about. But nevertheless, if you have an understanding of that, then you can recognise that the European Union in smashing nation states, in atomizing the working class, in creating individuals where there should be a solid mass thought, individualism and fragmentation is not something any of us want. We want to be in that state of solidarity so we can resist capitalist exploitation. Then we've got war, NATO, and the European defence forces being built up. We have the quest to control energy policy. The North Sea was a bone of contention in the referendum debate, but actually the real thing that was never mentioned by either side, I think, was that who's trying to control the new exploitation of the North Atlantic, for example. There's a big diplomatic conflict between growing up between the desire for the European Union to actually control those energy resources that countries, whether it was Britain, whether it was an independent Scotland, would simply not have had the power to resist the European Union trying to control your energy policy. And that should be looked into. There's a whole load of areas that we should look into. Allowing permanent legal rights to transatlantic capitalist corporations to actually dictate to nations' sovereign wealth, control the national rights, to supersede national rights, to be able to sue corporations, being able to sue whole countries. This is unheard of. This atomizes a country, it fragments a nation, it fragments nations that were created by their own working class. It's an attack on that working class. And Phil McGuire spoke and inspired me to think that I hope that he can inspire the People's Assembly to a clarity of understanding of opposing the European Union. And the whole thing about class consciousness can also be developed through such a campaign. And we just have to look around Europe. How has Greece got on over the last few years? How has Portugal got on? I've mentioned Ireland and the mass immigration and the disaster to its economy, the control of its banks by the European Central Bank. The European reform programme for this year is growing out of last year's 6th reform programme imposed upon Greece. The government employment had to be reduced by 150,000. That's a goal for 2015, to reduce employees and those civil servants and government employees in Greece. To privatise regional airports, ferries and gas. We can hear that coming and resonating with Calmac in Scotland. Introducing a market model into energy supply. Again, European Union control of that country's energy. Raising the retirement age to 67 in that country and further reducing their pensions. So, and then in that country you get the right, exploiting that golden dawn, a direct lineage from the Nazi era, cropping up and promising the working class a way out. That's again another reason why we should be in control of these campaigns. And the whole thing about free movement of labour over borders is not verging into racism at all. It's trade unions defending their long fought for rights of a wage, a living wage, and why should it be undermined by capitalism dividing the European working class in that way? So we've got to look into that carefully, kick the right out of the argument and take control of it. The same can be said of Cyprus, Portugal, Spain and other countries. We should look at them and be warned. And so there's plenty on the Scottish campaign against Eurofederalism. John keeps the website up to date with information like that about these countries and how they're being predated upon by the European Union. So how does that leave us? What should we do? In terms of trade, how could we survive outside Europe? Well, European trade just represents 20% of our global trade. Norway and Switzerland are good examples, and 80% of that trade can be consolidated with the wider world. So there's many reasons why we could actually campaign and be quite secure in our viewpoint of actually declaring the working class independent of the clutches of the European Union. And if there was a referendum on leaving the European Union, I would advocate leaving it for all those reasons. And I would try to harness all the alliances and more alliances that we've seen during this referendum campaign, mend fences and campaign to save the working class from the predations of the European Union.
Thanks very much, Eddie. We'll try and get some lively discussion. We should say that there are quite a lot of people that are ambivalent about the European Union, quite a lot of people in the trade union movement who have not been convinced, and quite a lot of people who are suspicious of the European Union but don't really know the arguments. So it is very important to get to grips with the issues. There has been a handout put round. I don't think they're quite enough for the number attended here, but maybe some people, if there's one spare, could hand them around if there's any not needed. So who's going to come into the discussion first?
The concept of capitalist collapse, and isn't the point really that capitalism actually isn't collapsing and that working people are still being made to pay the crisis of the system, because this is ultimately not a crisis of the cost of living as the pundits of New Labour and Ed Miliband and Ed Balls and what have you would have us believe. This is a crisis of the system. And so far, the system is working mighty fine from the vantage point of the ruling class and its political representatives. And the use of the term capitalist collapse in this context, I think, suggests that somehow there is a sort of an automatic, an element of it being an automatic sort of process, that the system is collapsing and all the movement has to do is either close its eyes and keep its fingers crossed or just give it a little gentle shove. There is still a massive amount, a huge amount of ideological work, political work and organisational work, not just in relation to Europe, but right across the board. And now that the last few months, the last 18 months to 2 years in the referendum campaign are over and done with, now perhaps not just the left of the movement, the Labour movement, but the entire movement has to take on board this issue of the European Union, and hopefully we will actually have more time, in fact, to do so. Making the link with some of the points that were actually made yesterday in relation to the campaign of austerity and what have you. This campaign of austerity is actually working. It's working very effectively. It's working very well. Because one of the things about offering solidarity to people in the European Union, and the Communist Party tabled a motion at the AGM yesterday, was that the point that was made was that in order to fully be able to offer solidarity, you have to have an analysis, a clear analysis of one of the main imperialist institutions, whose sole purpose is to prevent the development of an economic crisis actually being going in a direction which is favourable to working class people. Hence, the institutions of the European Union need to be thoroughly analysed. And I think Eddie's point about the need for a really major campaign of education, what have you, within the Labour movement as a whole is absolutely crucial. The key thing is that in this context of ongoing crisis, it is so deep and so serious that if the left, the whole of the left, doesn't get to grips with this problem, we are talking about a situation where people think in terms of the far right and fascism and what have you as actually necessarily mean, they confuse the form with the content of that concept, fascism. Would they confuse it with people in brown shirts and jackboots and all the rest of it? Well, I think we have to see what is being done, what is on offer from the likes of UKIP, what was on offer from the Tory party's conference only last week, is so far to the right. It's actually that is of the far right. And I think we need to be really, really clear about this. And this is an issue that is not going to go away. And in the course of the referendum campaign, for example, it was an issue when it was raised. It was never, well, in my judgment, I'm sure there will be comments here who will argue otherwise, but in my judgment, when it was raised, it was never satisfactorily answered. We now have an opportunity, now that the referendum campaign is over, to seriously address this question, because it is absolutely crucial that we get to grips with it. And I'll end on this point. As the crisis deepens, if the left fails to make, the whole of the left fails to make its explicitly socialist alternative more attractive, as the crisis deepens and deepens and deepens, then the response of the ruling class their crisis deepens is actually going to be to impose even more draconian, right-wing, nasty, completely unacceptable measures on the class and the movement. And it will destroy every last vestige of the trade union movement's ability to act in defence of the interests of working class people. So the issue of Europe is absolutely central to any strategy for left, progressive, democratic change in the direction of socialism. And we really need, the movement absolutely needs to get to grips with this question.
Maybe put a bit of a challenge. You heard Chris Stevens earlier, and he said, well, as far as he was concerned, we need to defend social Europe. And that's often put by people. And what we don't hear is concretely what are the key aspects of the European Union that work in the other direction, in fact, which have, might be argued, to completely undermine social Europe. So we need to be specific. What are the things that are wrong with the EU from the point of view of the left? So, anybody want to come in?
Can I just ask for a wee bit of clarification? Because when we raise this in my work, I work in local authority, and when we talk about leaving Europe, people say, well, Europe's actually quite good. The kind of things you've got for it, the European Court of Human Rights, all that kind of thing. And what people do is confuse that it's the European Court of Human Rights, which is formed, as you've said before, European Union. But it's in the media, it's always portrayed as European Union, the whole thing, like you're leaving. So even my wife, when I'm discussing it with her, she'll say to me, well, I don't get that. I mean, why do you want to throw all that out and become, and go away from all that? You've got to keep explaining the separation. So even I'm not too sure exactly what it is you don't want about Europe. I know it's the big business part of it, but how to explain that separates it away from European Court of Human Rights and the good things you want to keep.
The European Court of Human Rights has absolutely nothing to do with the EU. It's a quite different legal structure set up by the Council of Europe 1949, and which exists independently of the European Union. Russia, for instance, is a member, as are a number of other states that are Switzerland, Norway. So it's quite different from the European Union, and was there before it. So that's a key point to actually put your finger on, Peter. I think you're quite right. We have to explain it to people.
This is all the mainstream media, though, blurring the lines.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's where they personalise it, bring the people that have their hands on and stuff like that. You get off because of human rights and what I mean? Excuse me. I've actually had a slightly different experience in the sense that I've actually worked in Europe and lived there, and I've also worked in the new states of Eastern Europe, of states which became independent since 1945, and most of them, in fact, since 1990. And I've been involved in the accession programmes, involved in managing projects for the EU on economic regeneration and on civil society. And I can see the positive benefits because there is a framework which is regarded as being part of the European Union. And there is a social framework and there are tests which these countries have to meet before they can actually even become part of the EU. And these involve basic political, civil and human rights. And they also involve meeting certain standards in these areas. And without the EU, there would not be the same inroads made into issues such as racism and to the acceptance of human rights, which particularly in the new states. And I think the growing number of European organisations has been affected by it, has been part of this framework. I feel that there are two considerations. I think one is we have to feel that compared to the countries in Europe, Britain has never had much of a commitment to European cooperation. It's something that you see what you can get out of it for your own self, but you don't actually take the framework very seriously. And I think the left is as guilty, and particularly the Labour Party has been guilty of this as anyone else, because their inability to embrace the concept of Europe and to look at the alternatives has played a big role in the anti-European position of other political parties and particularly the press. Now it means standing up. You've got left-wing parties throughout Europe. You have a social democratic alliance. What has Britain contributed to it? And that I think is one of the key questions, because it's only by working together that you can actually start to create the kind of frameworks that might survive and that could survive. And I think the left has to be responsive, has to look at this with two aims. One is, yes, you want a long-term frame of total reconstruction. Yes, you see that capitalism could collapse, but capitalism has the ability throughout history to transmorph, to go into many changes. And for, say, Britain to leave the EU would be a complete disaster, because after all, most of our employment legislation is actually part of EU law. We wouldn't have the conditions of employment such as the directive in hours if the EU wasn't there. I think the second thing is to think that you can survive without the EU then leaves open, well, how else do you survive? Who are the other potential partners? The most likely thing is simply more US influence and simply a depression further of working conditions. Because one of the things we should be campaigning for through Europe is to try to get the left to come together on trying to get, in the short term, it's our responsibility to try and protect people in the next 20 years as well as looking ahead to the future. You have to protect families now, you have to protect working people. You get together on these.
How do you feel about TTAP yourself?
I feel it has to be opposed. I feel there should be a Europe-wide campaign by the left against this. It is so desperately important.
I shouldn't have allowed
Yeah.
Sorry
you to come in and...
That's fine. Yeah.
Anyway, have you finished? Yeah.
Yeah, for the time being. That's
The hands I saw going up were Tommy, and then
I
I think we're over there. Okay.
I think the first point, just to respond to what you're saying, Comrade, about employment legislation. Of course, things like the Working Time Directive and health and safety legislation really crumbs off the table. I mean, there's absolutely no reason whatsoever that a progressive government, be it in Scotland or Britain, could not implement such policies. Regards who the European Union is operating for, I think certainly at the moment it's operating for the strongest economy in Europe, which is Germany. If we look at some of the if you're saying looking at a left critique of the European Union, you can point to, for instance, the removed democratic governments in Italy and Greece. They've imposed the impoverishment that Eddie prefers rather than austerity. They use mass unemployment to control the trade unions and to assist their drive to keep down wages, pensions, social benefits, etc. I think working in local government, we've got to win the understanding that the drive to privatisation of our public services emanates from Europe. I think there is some understanding in the trade union with regards to TTIP. There's a growing understanding of that because it's certainly a major issue at both Unison Conference and Unite. But the same people who are arguing against TTIP are also main arguments in support of the European Union. So I think one of the helpful things I think the Morning Star could do would be to answer sort of question that Peter raised when you argue at the shop floor, because people say, well, aren't you just taking the position of likes of UKIP, of the far right within the Conservative Party, which of course we're not, but the point had been made at the beginning with John in that, I think it's Eddie, when the only opponents of the European Union is seen to be the far right, as opposed to there is a left critique of the European Union, and I think the Morning Star could play an educational role within the movement on that issue.
Thanks very much.
Tommy's taken most of my points there, but to answer one question that Comrade asked there in regards to how would we survive outside of the EU, a quick answer to that is that Norway is not in the EU. And I noticed throughout the referendum campaign, Norway was often championed as a bastion of social democracy, so it certainly seems possible to do that with the EU. John was asking us elements of the EU that perhaps aren't so are considered positive to the left. And the Growth and Stability Pact means that our debt has to be below 60% of GDP. Now, and our deficit also has to be 3% of GDP. I think in Scotland, someone correct me, I thought it was 8%, but someone recently corrected me and said it was 5.5%. So that's the case. So it's still above what the EU's demands are. And I also believe there's new legislation coming in which is going to reduce the deficit to 0.5%, so even lower. Now, obviously, that means that to have a Keynesian economic policies where we can stimulate the economy, that's not so much an option. It imposes austerity, as Tommy was saying. It's really not an option. We're going to have to reduce our debt, reduce our deficit. But that takes me on to something I wanted to ask, because it's something I often come up with against when it comes to the EU, is this question of withdrawal versus reform. And I wondered what your response to that was. I understand the EU Commission's unelected. Now that says to me that withdrawal's the only option anyway, because there's no democratic influence over it. But I'm sure you're familiar with some of the arguments on that. So.
Thanks very much. That's very nice. University, he went off and was working in the Baltic States. Just published a book which you can buy on Routledge about what happened in the Baltic States. He was there for about, I think, 4 or 5 years studying it deeply. And the current levels of unemployment are in most of them pretty dire, massive levels of emigration. The wages are 1/5 in Estonia, and Latvia and Lithuania are what they are in Sweden. That's why people emigrate so much. And there has been a massive loss of social welfare. So there have been some things that were good, but although you get formal agreement to issues of race equality, for instance, when you've got mass unemployment, when you've got mass migration, because as people move out, people come in to take an even lower level of wages, this is all outlined, it is an engine for the growth unfortunately, for racism. But I was just mentioning that people can get hold of that book. And we need to know, we may not all agree on this, but it might be the kind of sense lowest common denominator of agreement. We need to know what are the things in terms of neoliberalism we do oppose in the EU. The first thing I would have thought going on the list is the fiscal compact of 2012. That's the thing that's at the top of that handout, which was condemned by the European PUC, by most of the left parties, about all of them, I think. And you can see what it does. It goes forward from the Stability and Growth Pact, which limited deficits to 3%, to 0.5. In other words, a balanced budget by 2018. And remember, unfortunately, not just Mr. Osborne, but actually the Labour Party is talking about a balanced budget by 2018. That means impoverishment, to use your word, Eddie, or it's a process of cutting social provision. That's essentially what it is. And I think that seems to me to be one thing. If we're looking at what's happened to all these countries which have got deficits in excess of 3% and now 0.5, Greece, Portugal, where you've got youth unemployment over half, 50% of the population, 25% adult employment, where you've got a slashing of all these social services that are listed and massive privatisation programs, that seems to be one thing we have to oppose. The second thing that I would have thought has to be opposed is the legal judgments of the European Court of Justice, different court, which have said that it is, in terms of law, in terms of the European Treaty, the right to establish a firm and to operate as a firm competitively in a market without hindrance, that goes before the rights of collective labour. And therefore, if collective labour organises in a way that prejudices a right of a firm to establish, and establish in particular in another state, then it is illegal to use collective action and to go on strike. Or even for a country like Luxembourg, which had one of its acts of parliament struck down, to impose a living wage, if it is different from that of an establishment. So that seems to me to be another one. Is that agreed that something that we should attack? And that, of course, is embedded in the Luxembourg Treaty, because that's where the law judgment came from, because of the priority of the law of establishment. Those seem to be two things that we need to pick up. Then there's the laws on state aid, which say that it is not legal for a country to give any aid to a commercial enterprises that prejudices the commercial position of others. The Royal Bank of Scotland was taken into public ownership when it went bankrupt, 87%. It is now being required to be sold off under the provisions of the European Union. But it also applies to any other form of state aid. It could have remained of great benefit to the people if it had been a state-owned bank. We need one that supplies cash directly to industry. But it was sold, it's being sold off, so is the Bank of Scotland, public sector elements of having to be taken out. And you can take that for any industry. So would there be agreement about that? And thirdly, fourthly, I think, we've got the various directives that do make it very difficult to maintain things in public ownership or to take them back into public ownership. For instance, Caledonian ferries have had a very difficult time surviving because of the contractual position that they're obliged, the Scottish Government is obliged to follow under EU law. But if you look at the regulations about railway transport, about the postal services, about energy, right the way through, they insist on competition. And therefore makes it very difficult for a comprehensive publicly owned utility to operate. That seems to me also to be something that's prejudicial, inherent in the way in which the European single market and the directives that stem from it operate. And of course the single market was designed by Mrs. Thatcher and her ministers in 1986 as a way of particularly opening up financial services and energy to British companies at that point. So that's me finished. I shouldn't have come in under abusing the rights of the chair, but I think it's important to be specific on these matters. We need to know what the bad things are to be able to put a finger on them and say, yes, these things are the things that need to go, even if we don't agree, sitting here in this room, that we should be trying to withdraw from the EU or not withdraw from the EU. So it seems to be those four things. I need to come back and then we'll have a report back in the next session.
Yeah, that was a great point that Ruth made. I think we all need to know more about this subject, basically, myself included. But the fact is, I wandered into a meeting about the EU in 1997. I think you were there. And ever since then, I've grappled with this subject. It's been a fascinating subject, and it did lead actually to major debates in the Scottish Trade Union Congress. During that period, of course, in the Trade Union Congress in London as well and other places. But I see Tommy sitting there. That reminds me. Clyde Bank Trades Council and Kilmarnock, they were some of the prime movers behind resolutions against the euro itself, and how that was very bad for trade unions. The book in the stall there saying the euro bad for trade unions. That's a historical debate now. But actually we won that debate. I think to a great extent the trade unions were in the lead. Once those motions, after several years of debate, started to get passed at regional trade union congresses, at the TUC and at the STUC, the ball was really rolling, and we were in control of that campaign to a great extent, and the euro was kicked into touch. I think we can do the same with these key points that we've gathered to follow about the bad side of the European Union. I think we can grasp them and take the argument further. If you look at take Simon's point very well, he put it very well, that capitalist collapse is very much not a collapse that will happen without us giving it a kick or a push. That's got to happen, of course. They're well in control and they're triply exploiting us, and as the crisis deepens, that gets more draconian. I certainly take that on board. As to benign legislation coming from Europe, I think if we're really serious about a socialist country, a socialist society, we can enact our own pro-working class legislation in this country. The European Court of Justice, as John said, has implemented all these rulings against collective bargaining and against state aid. And the fact is that, like last year, the government started to implement this rule against collective bargaining. That is the tool in the armoury of the working class that we should never let go, because otherwise, if that lets go, we're atomised, we're fragmented, we're powerless. And Vince Cable recommended this Beecroft report for collective bargaining at the national level to be terminated and the unfair dismissal rule to be abolished. And all that kind of thing, that's coming from Europe. And the Tory government is eagerly implementing this kind of thing. And if you look at this trade partnership with America, it's an EU-US, it's America, European Union in cahoots. They're getting together to defend the capitalist world. All the talk that there used to be about this benign European Union defending us against American imperialism has been proved actually an empty thought. It's a real US-EU alliance that we're seeing unfolding before us. And if you look through Europe, we've got lots of friends in the working class movement. of Europe. The meetings we've had in Glasgow have included speakers from Portugal. There's a great speaker who lives in Glasgow now from Portugal who gave us the lowdown on the real impoverishment in that society. We had a Greek speaker, we had an Irish speaker at several meetings, and speakers from Sweden and Spain as well. So there's no lack of worker solidarity and trade union and party solidarity throughout Europe. We're keeping in touch with all these people and we're trying to reinforce that. I think you've really got to have your own integrity, your own standing on your own feet, your own national popular sovereignty, and then you can have real alliances with comrades in other countries and get the ball moving in that. The slogan of that 18th October demo rally is a good one, coming from the TUC, I think. Britain needs a pay rise. We all need a pay rise. And it's that simple thought that brings you into conflict with the European Union, who are trying to beat down wages and cause that impoverishment that the Poverty Alliance in Scotland is talking about. So it's for all those reasons that I oppose the European Union, and I think those points that we made there are a good way forward for this debate to proceed. So we got a good note of that, Chris?
Yeah, I've got a note of the 5 points that you want to make, and there's one at least 3 points.
So I think now that we've arrived at that, I won't say any more today, and let's go forward on that consensus. So thanks.